Los Angeles police have been giving more information about their investigation into the deaths of Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa. New information about the deaths of Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa. When the FBI arrived at the office in New York City's financial district, it was already empty. Desks were cleared out, files were shredded, and the man they were there to arrest was nowhere to be found. Gene Hackman's longtime financial advisor had disappeared just hours before being questioned for ransoming. But this wasn't just about fraud. Gene Hackman left behind an $80 million fortune that seemed to vanish overnight. His children, who were already shocked that they weren't mentioned in the will, were left speechless. There was no money, no inheritance, and no sign of the wealth their father had built. The question now was simple but terrifying: who had taken it all? The FBI's arrival at the prestigious financial firm in downtown Manhattan should have been routine. They were carrying arrest warrants. Warrants, evidence of fraud, and a clear trail of embezzlement that led directly to Daniel Whitmore, Gene Hackman's financial advisor. But instead of a scared man scrambling to cover his tracks, they found an empty office that looked like it had never been used. The desks were clean, the computers were empty, and all traces of paperwork had been carefully erased. The investigation quickly spread to Whitmore's apartment, a luxury penthouse that should have been full of personal belongings and bank documents. But when the police arrived, they found the same eerie emptiness. His closets were empty, his furniture was still in its original place, and his phone was disconnected. A quick look at his financial records showed that his last transaction was a one-way ticket out of the country that he paid for in cash. The FBI was too late. He had vanished into thin air. At the same time, news hit the Hackman family that Gene Hackman had completely taken his children out of his will. The late Hollywood star's $80 million estate did not go to his 3 children or his extended family. Instead, it was put into a mysterious trust that no one seemed to be able to control. This discovery was just as shocking as Whitmore's sudden disappearance. The timing of Whitmore's escape was also very strange. Hackman's children found out they would not be getting their inheritance at the same time that Whitmore went missing. What started out as a normal case of financial fraud quickly turned into a much bigger crime. Theft on a scale that had never been seen before in Hollywood history. The money was gone, and the only person who knew where it went had disappeared without a trace. Hackman's children had more questions than answers. Could this really have been their father's last wish? Had he really meant to leave them nothing, or had he been tricked in his last days with rumors of his Alzheimer's? Diagnosis: doctors were not sure if he fully understood what he... Even scarier was the idea that someone might have used Hackman's failing health to pull off the biggest financial heist Hollywood had ever seen. As the legal battles between Hackman's family and the estate's lawyers got worse, the media went crazy. Hollywood was used to inheritance disputes, but this one was extra strange because Hackman's $80 million fortune had been stolen, leaving no assets to fight over. The court case wasn't just about inheritance. It was also about finding the missing money. The FBI wasn't just looking for a financial advisor, they were after a ghost. A man who seemed to have planned his disappearance months in advance. The real question was, who else had helped him pull it off? The will that shocked Hollywood. For years, Gene Hackman's will had been kept secret from the public. When it was finally made public, it sent shockwaves through Hollywood. A simple split of Hackman's assets among his children turned into one of the most controversial estate battles in recent history. Instead of giving his entire fortune to his family, he put it all into an anonymous trust. The official paperwork said the money was set aside for charitable donations, but Hackman's children Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie were left in the dark. They knew their father was private, but they never thought he would be so mysterious. They had grown apart from him over the years, but this was way worse than they had imagined. At first, they thought it was a mistake, but when they saw the legal papers, it was clear that not a single dollar would go to his biological children. What was even stranger was the situation with Hackman's wife, Betsy. The will said that Hackman had to outlive her by 90 days in order to inherit her assets, but he only outlived her by a week. Because of this strange clause, none of her money was given to him. The whole Hackman fortune was now held by unknown financial handlers. At the center of this complicated legal mess was Daniel Whitmore. As Hackman's longtime financial advisor, he had handled all of the estate planning. He was also the only person in charge of the mysterious trust, and now that he was gone, Hackman's children started to think something was very wrong. Did their father really want to keep them out of his will, or had he been forced to do it? Legal experts started to look into Hackman's mental state in his last few months. His Alzheimer's diagnosis raised serious questions about whether he had been sane enough to make such a drastic decision. Hackman's children were ready to fight the will in court, but before they could even file their first motion, they got an even bigger surprise. The trust fund had been completely emptied. There were no more assets, no luxury homes, and nothing hidden offshore. Forensic accountants were called in to look into what happened, and what they found was shocking. Hackman's money had been taken out of the trust account in a planned way in the months before he died. At first, the withdrawals were small and hard to track, but over time, they got bigger and bigger until the trust was empty. What had seemed like a legal loophole was now looking more like theft. Hackman's children weren't just victims of a cruel will, they had been robbed. Daniel Whitmore was on the run just as the FBI started to look into his movements in the weeks before he disappeared. They noticed something odd. His financial activity didn't show any signs of panic. He hadn't rushed to withdraw large amounts of money or tried to cover his tracks in a last-minute frenzy. Instead, every move he made seemed like it had been planned out for months. Authorities found that just before Hackman's death, Whitmore had gotten a flight to the Cayman Islands. A well-known tax haven was paid for in advance with money from an untraceable offshore account. He hadn't just run away. He had already started getting ready for his new life. Investigators knew that Whitmore couldn't have been the only one who drained the Hackman estate without raising suspicions. Someone in the financial industry had helped move the money, and someone in the legal system had let the will go through. Someone close to Hackman made sure that the fraud wasn't noticed until it was too late. Hackman's children wanted to know how a $80 million fortune could disappear overnight. Even if Whitmore had been in charge of the accounts, there should have been paper trails, legal barriers, or some kind of oversight. The lack of these red flags pointed to something much bigger than simple theft. The FBI wasn't just looking for a missing financial advisor. They were after a ONGF. As they dug deeper, they found something even scarier. This wasn't Whitmore's first time pulling this scam. It was a pattern. No one saw this coming. As the investigation went on, it became clear that Gene Hackman's money going missing wasn't an isolated incident. The FBI found a disturbing pattern of financial manipulation that went far beyond Hackman's estate. Other famous clients who had once trusted Daniel Whitmore with their money also fell for the scam. Rich people had also lost money in mysterious ways. Their money had gone missing after going through offshore accounts and disappearing into thin air. The more investigators looked into it, the scarier it became. Whitmore had been running a long-running financial fraud operation, using his special access to Hollywood's elite to pull off a series of planned thefts. The scheme had been carefully put together, with small transfers, gradual account withdrawals, and a network of shell companies were used to hide where the stolen money ended up. Hackman's estate was the biggest prize, but his children, who were desperate for justice, hired forensic accountants to find his missing millions. What they found only raised more red flags. In the months before his death, millions of dollars had been moved between banks, sent through international wire transfers, and then disappeared into private accounts held in countries with strict banking secrecy. The exact timing of the transactions showed that Whitmore had planned this for a long time before Hackman's death. Investigators made a big discovery when they found a secret network of people connected to Whitmore. These weren't just financial advisors or accountants. They were high-level members of a larger financial crime syndicate. Whitmore wasn't just a rogue investor. He was part of a plan to steal money from estates that didn't know what was going on. Hackman was just another victim in a long line of silly evidence. The evidence painted a scary picture. Hackman's money had probably been stolen before he died, and the will was just a distraction to keep his kids from realizing what had happened. Had Hackman been manipulated? Had his Alzheimer's been used against him? The thought made Hackman's kids sick to their stomachs. They weren't just fighting for an inheritance. They were finding out about a huge crime that had probably ruined many lives before their dads. One scary fact made things even worse. The money wasn't just missing, someone had stolen it all. Whitmore wasn't the only one involved. He had help, which meant the hunt wasn't just for one criminal. The FBI was now dealing with a web of criminals, each more dangerous than the last. The real question was, who else knew about this? And if Hackman had been targeted, who would be next to be betrayed by a confidant? The most shocking discovery came when Hackman's children started looking deeper into their father's inner circle. They saw that not all of Hackman's closest friends could be trusted. One had been working with Whitmore the whole time. This person was a confidant who knew all of Hackman's personal and financial business. This person was close enough to Hackman to be able to convince him to sign legal documents he might not have fully understood. Investigators found a trail of communications between Whitmore and an unnamed associate who had been feeding him information. Hackman's declining mental health was revealed in emails that were encrypted and buried deep within deleted files. It wasn't just about stealing money, it was about controlling Hackman's entire legacy. One exchange stood out. It was sent just 3 months before Hackman died and said, "He doesn't ask questions anymore, just tell me when to finalize." This meant one thing. Someone had planned to ruin Hackman's finances before he died. Hackman's children were still trying to understand what this meant. Their father had trusted the wrong people, and that trust had been used against him. The betrayal didn't just come from Whitmore, it came from someone who had been in the house and in Hackman's good graces. The FBI now had a new target, someone who had benefited from the estate's decline and knew exactly where Whitmore was. But just as they were getting close to their next suspect, something even scarier happened. A key player in the scheme disappeared, the missing witness. The FBI had just started to piece together the fraud network when a key witness disappeared. A former business associate of Whitmore who had been cooperating with police had gone missing overnight. His apartment had been left unlocked, his car was still in the driveway, and his cell phone had been left on the kitchen counter with the power on. There were no signs of a fight and no security footage of an abduction. There was just an empty house and a missing man. His disappearance sent a clear message. Someone was tying up loose ends. The people who helped Whitmore escape weren't just after money, they were willing to kill anyone who was a threat to their plan. Hackman's children were getting more and more desperate as the days went by. With every step forward, someone else disappeared. The stolen fortune had become a matter of life and death, and if they weren't careful, they could be next. As the police tried to find out who else was involved in the scheme, their main concern was Whitmore's next move. If he had help disappearing, that meant he had help staying hidden, but he wasn't just hiding from the police, he was hiding from the people he had been working with. This led to a scary theory. Whitmore wasn't in charge anymore. He had been a part of a bigger plan, but now he was a liability. If the people behind the fraud thought he might expose them, he wouldn't be able to. It wasn't just about finding the stolen money anymore, it was also about finding Whitmore before someone else did. A trail of lies. As the FBI looked deeper into the case, they found a troubling financial pattern that had been going on long before Whitmore went missing. What at first seemed like a single case of theft quickly turned out to be much more sinister. Whitmore had been selling assets, moving money around, and investing smartly in offshore accounts for almost a decade. It was the last piece in a much bigger puzzle that had been carefully put together long before Gene Hackman died. With the help of forensic accountants, investigators carefully tracked the flow of stolen money. What they found was shocking. Whitmore had hidden assets in at least 5 different countries, using a complex network of shell companies to hide where the money came from. Millions of dollars had disappeared overnight and been buried in offshore investments. This wasn't the work of an amateur opportunist, it was a professional operation meant to steal money from high-profile estates without leaving a trace. But the biggest surprise came when police found a hidden document deep in Hackman's legal files. It was an amendment to his will that was written just weeks before he died, and it stopped his children from getting anything. The timing was chilling. Just as Hackman's death was happening, the document was being found. As Hackman's health was getting worse, someone made sure that his huge fortune would be moved somewhere else, out of reach of his rightful heirs. At first glance, everything seemed legit. The paperwork was in order, and Hackman's signature was clearly visible on the document. But forensic handwriting analysts were brought in to make sure it was real, and what they found shocked everyone involved in the investigation. The ink, the pressure of the strokes, and the small differences in each letter didn't match Hackman's previous work. Analysis of the signatures strongly suggested that Hackman's will had been forged. If that was true, then this wasn't just a case of fraud, it was a massive conspiracy. Someone had messed with Hackman's estate in his dying days, possibly without his knowledge. Someone had used his failing health to steal his money before anyone could stop them. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about lying, betrayal, and the planned destruction of a man's legacy. The children were already devastated when they found out they weren't in the will, but now they had to face the horrifying possibility that their father had been forced to sign it. Had he been alone in his last days, surrounded by people who only saw him as a money-making opportunity? If the will had been faked, who could have changed it without raising suspicion? The more the investigation went on, the darker the truth became. This wasn't an accident. It had been planned for years and carried out by people who had positioned Hackman at just the right time. With the mastermind still on the run and millions of dollars still missing, one thing was clear: whoever was behind this had gotten away with it before, and unless they were stopped, they would do it again, the mastermind said. The FBI had been following a trail of financial fraud for months, but now they finally had a name. It wasn't a random con artist or an anonymous offshore accountant. It was someone with a deep connection to Gene Hackman's life. This wasn't an act of greed, it was a betrayal that was carefully planned over a number of years. The suspect had portrayed themselves as an invaluable advisor who could be trusted with Hackman's money and health. They were responsible for slowly reorganizing the actor's estate and putting all of his assets into a controlled trust fund that looked real but was actually a money-making scam. The more investigators looked into it, the more suspicious it became. As more was learned, it became clear that Hackman may never have known how badly he had been manipulated. Medical records painted an even scarier picture. In his last years, Hackman's mental health was getting worse, making him an easy target for abuse. Under the guise of making his finances easier, the criminal had tricked him into giving away his fortune while keeping his children at a distance. The will had been changed at just the right time to make sure that when he died, there would be no children to claim it. It was even more shocking when FBI agents found messages between the mastermind and Whitmore that showed the two had been working together for a lot longer than anyone had thought. Whitmore was supposed to carry out the financial part of the plan, but the real puppeteer had been working from the inside, influencing Hackman's decisions long before he died. This news shocked Hackman's family, who had thought Whitmore had been acting as the puppeteer. It was clear that Hackman was only a small part of a much bigger scheme. The next step was clear: they needed to act quickly to get back any of Hackman's stolen money. But there was one big problem. The mastermind had already disappeared. The person who planned the theft had hid their tracks so well that even experienced detectives were now one step behind. The chase was on, but the trail was dead. Realizing that the money had already been laundered and spent was a shock. The FBI had been following a complicated web of financial transactions for months, hoping to find offshore accounts where the stolen money was safely stashed. But the criminal had set up such a perfect financial smokescreen, spreading the money so thinly that it would be nearly impossible to get even a small amount of it back. Every lead led to a new dead end, and every bank transfer went into a web of untraceable shell companies. This wasn't just a theft, it was a masterclass in financial deception. An investigation found a web of shell companies registered in different countries under different names. Each one looked real on paper, but their only purpose was to move money and hide where it came from. Hackman's stolen millions went through many offshore accounts, each controlled by a fake identity. This way, even if one was caught, the money would have already been moved to another account. The scheme was so complicated that even experienced forensic accountants had trouble putting it all together. Europe, luxury businesses in the Middle East, and political donations that looked like charitable donations. The money was put in places where it would be impossible to get it back. Hackman's estate had been robbed, and his assets had been turned into high-value goods, which made the paper trail even less clear. Worse, a big chunk of it had been put into global financial markets, where it looked like real investments. The mastermind had made sure that even if the police caught them, the stolen wealth would never be found. Hackman's children were devastated. It wasn't just about getting their inheritance, it was about justice. They had spent months fighting for their father's fortune, only to find out that it was gone forever. Even if they won their legal battle, they would inherit nothing but debts and a family name now linked to one of Hollywood's biggest financial scandals. This was a heavy realization, but they weren't ready to give up yet. They were determined to find out the truth, so they hired a private investigator. They told investigators to keep looking because if they couldn't get the money back, they would at least make sure that everyone involved was held responsible. Their search turned up an unexpected discovery, a secret ledger with information about a lot more than just Hackman's missing money. It was a plan for a crime syndicate that had been active for years and was going after more than just the late actor's estate. The ledger had records of fraudulent transactions, suspicious wire transfers, and the names of other famous victims, Hackman's. The estate was just one of many caught up in a worldwide scheme that stole money from celebrities, business leaders, and wealthy families. The mastermind wasn't just a con artist. They were the architect of one of the most complex fraud networks in history. The discovery changed everything. It wasn't just about Hackman anymore. It was about stopping a financial predator before another fortune went missing. It was a much more detailed investigation than anyone had imagined. They carefully kept track of every fraudulent transaction going back years. The report didn't just list past crimes. It also listed future targets, showing exactly who the fraudsters were planning to trick next. The FBI was shocked. What had seemed like a Hollywood inheritance scandal turned out to be a global crime syndicate preying on wealthy estates before their owners had even died. Hackman's fortune had been carefully stolen over time. Fraud was still going on, and if the FBI didn't act quickly, another high-profile estate would be robbed. With new evidence, investigators stepped up their search. An international sting operation was set up to track digital footprints, offshore transfers, and hidden assets. Agents worked to find out who the mastermind was, while financial experts followed the money trail. This was the first direct lead they had, and they were on the trail. Hackman's children, meanwhile, took the fight to the courts. Finding the ledger gave them new reasons to sue, and they demanded that all financial transactions involving their father be stopped right away. Even if they couldn't get back the stolen millions, they could at least stop more damage from happening. Their lawsuit sent shockwaves through Hollywood, and other wealthy families began to wonder if they had also been targeted. Then, in a shocking turn of events, revealed buried deep in the ledger were coded entries that pointed to a second mastermind, a partner who had been working quietly behind the scenes. While the FBI had been focusing on one suspect, this discovery showed that a second player had been just as involved. They weren't just looking for one fraudster, they were after a whole criminal network. If they didn't act now, the criminals would disappear again, this time taking even more money with them. The FBI had to strike before the operation could go underground again. The big showdown was almost here, but would they catch both criminals before it was too late? As dawn broke over Monaco's beautiful coastline, the gentle hum of luxury cars and the murmur of the waking elite were broken up by the loud approach of an international task force. The coordinated raid was the end of months of relentless pursuit that had reached the continent's financial institutions and the highest levels of power. As heavily armed agents stormed through the grand estate, the mastermind, the criminals responsible for one of Hollywood's biggest financial crimes, were found relaxing in silk robes and drinking expensive wine. They seemed completely unaffected by the damage they had caused. Their lack of fear and arrogance made it seem like they thought they couldn't be caught, until now. Within seconds, the criminals were caught and their estate was swarmed by investigators eager to find every trace of their fraudulent empire. Inside the huge mansion, authorities found a treasure trove of encrypted evidence. There were bank records, handwritten notes about fraudulent transactions, and a safe full of fake legal documents. This was not only the key to Hackman's case, it was the smoking gun connecting them to a decade of high-profile financial fraud. However, the victory was bittersweet. Hackman's children had fought for justice, but they knew the truth. Most of the money was lost in a web of international money laundering schemes, invested in assets that no court could get back, or funneled into accounts that couldn't be tracked. It was almost impossible for the children to get back all of their father's money after the mastermind was caught. Hackman's estate had been robbed bare, and the thieves had made sure that no amount of legal action could restore what had been lost. Finally, Whitmore, the financial advisor who had started the whole crime, was found in a remote villa in Brazil. His lifestyle was a shadow of what his partner had built, but his role in the crime was just as important. When he was extradited to the United States, he had no choice but to cooperate, giving damning evidence that brought down the mastermind's whole scheme. His confessions revealed details that not even the FBI had found, like offshore accounts hidden behind layers of digital encryption, dishonest officials who had turned a blind eye, and a web of criminal associates who had helped the fraud run for years. As the courtroom drama played out, the case became a media sensation, exposing one of the most complex and sneaky financial crimes ever seen in American Hollywood. Although Hackman's wealth was the main focus of the story, authorities later found that it was only the tip of the iceberg. Dozens of other high-profile estates had also been targeted and their wealth stolen in eerily similar ways. Gene Hackman was not the first victim. His case was just the one that finally brought it all to light. The most disturbing thought was how many more people had fallen victim to this scheme and been robbed without even realizing it. The end. Or were there still more criminals waiting for their next move? The shocking truth about Gene Hackman's missing fortune has finally been revealed, but the damage it caused can't be fixed. His children may have found justice, but the money that was supposed to secure their future is now lost forever, in a web of lies that crossed borders. The mastermind may be in jail and Whitmore may have been forced to talk, but the chilling truth remains. This wasn't an isolated case. How many others were involved? Other estates have been hacked. How many more fortunes have disappeared without a trace? And most importantly, who else is still out there ready to strike again? What do you think about this shocking Hollywood scandal? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking stories.